Hello guys, it's National Master Kevin Yang back at it with another video, and today we will be talking about one of our chess club members games and how I approach this game. So, just like I promised, I play something different all the time, right? So I played knight f3, and one of my recommendations goes g3 and d3 and all these small moves, right? So I went g3, bishop g2, and my opponent went straight for the center, which is a line, definitely. And I played d3, usual, right? I want to, because if castles, then black plays e4 to threaten the knight, and then I have to move back. And then some people play h5, and it gets all crazy. Get them marching the pawn up, get the bishop out, try to attack this pawn. It gets a little dangerous for white here. So that's why people usually play d3 before to prevent this move. Because now, here, take, takes, right? The knight takes, and now the knight gets to come here because the knight went back, and the bishop threatens the pawn, and the knight can come here and possibly reach the square. And if king takes d8, knight g5, threatening this pawn, threatening this pawn. f5 to try to protect this pawn. Knight checks, takes the rook, fork on the king. Okay, so that's why people don't push right now. So knight f6 comes, I castle, quick development, maybe get this guy here, maybe get the knight here, or another alternative is get the knight here and support the push of this pawn, right? Another alternative is the queen moving over, the pawn up. Another alternative is knight over and pawn up. So we want to achieve this central push, right? We don't want to look too bad, but for right now we just seem a little bit cramped. So what happens here is my opponent plays bishop c5, and correctly, because we want to take control of the center, right? So bishop c5, completely accurate, but in this case, I could have done this. Remember, always, the center fork trick is nasty. In this case, it's harmless, but still, maybe something we have to watch out for. If I took, right, which I didn't, knight takes, I move this pawn up, threaten both pieces, the bishop would go back, takes, bishop takes, and let's say something like c4, right? And now we threaten to trade queens and maybe destroy the pawn structure if he takes. So, I don't know, maybe it could have been a possible move for me, but I instead decided to opt for knight c3, developing, maybe playing e4 on the next move since I have 1 and 2 guarding this square, right? So I could play here next move, or I could develop the bishop out, because okay, I'll explain. But castles, and I decided to play bishop g5. Here, I think I still have the move knight takes, and then d4 to threaten both of these pieces. But, I mean, I don't know. I think it's a good move. But instead I played bishop g5. Yeah, the engine is definitely saying that knight takes, the center fork trick with d4 is still the best. So I guess that was a miss on my part. So I played bishop g5, okay? My plan is, if black does nothing, let's say a6, right? Bishop takes, queen takes, and knight takes. But if bishop takes, pawn takes. Now I get to play e4. I have 1, I have 2. He only has 1, so we're good. And my opponent played h6. And this move also is somewhat the same as a6, right? They serve as the same functions. Unfortunately, they don't do much to stop me from taking the knight and then taking the pawn, but I would say a good move instead would be bishop e6 was possible, right? Or I think better to avoid this center fork trick would just be bishop e7. And here, let's say I play here, then you could play like bishop, or you could take, and something like bishop e6, right? So this would be about equal. So I play bishop g5, and remember, bishop e7 or bishop e6, those are the moves. Bishop takes, queen takes, knight takes. Now I have an extra pawn and I want to hold on to it. Queen d8. He wants to protect this pawn, and rightly so. c4, knight d4. Now, this move, right? I like the move itself. I like it that we're trying to get space, maybe push this pawn out, right? But you always got to watch out. I can take this pawn, right? So if you look back here, this knight was previously defending this pawn already. But once the knight moved there, now I can take the pawn, right? Well, some people might be thinking, okay, what about this move? Well, I think one move, this looks a little bit tricky because if f4, then c6 or f6 will do the job, right? And if knight f3, knight takes, king h1, followed by rook out is possible, but the knight can retreat to d4, right? So c6, for example, d4 to attack this bishop, knight takes, pawn takes, and c takes. And white is up a pawn, right? He's up this pawn, but maybe the position is good enough for black. Queen f6, first of all, right? Going for this b2 pawn. Say knight b5, going for the fork, and black could play queen b6 again. Get on this pawn, get on the knight, maybe look down at this pawn. So black definitely has chances here after this long variation. So yeah, maybe knight takes, rook e8. Let's see what the engine says. Engine says the move knight takes f7. Okay, takes, play pawn to e3, threaten the knight. The knight goes back. I play d4, threaten the bishop f8, and f4. Wow, that's powerful. f5 is coming, queen h5 is coming, knight c3, getting the rooks out, getting the pawn up, right? It's kind of like a central push. And I would definitely not see this in a game. I think this is a really clever solution. Rook b1, instead of taking the pawn, which I did think I could have took the pawn, but I said to my opponent, I'm going to give you a move to protect it, right? So I played rook b1 just as a waiting move, but here I was planning b4, right? So knight takes, bishop takes, and now rook e8 protects the pawn. But now, this pawn isn't under attack, right? And so black doesn't necessarily have to protect this pawn. It was just something from before. Now that black removed the attacker, right? The attacker was removed, then black doesn't have to defend this pawn. This pawn's not threatened immediately. So, whenever you make a move, you want to always ask yourself, are there any pieces hanging? What is your opponent's next move, right? So I was definitely going to play this pawn push next move. And as I said in one of my previous videos, I introduced the concept of prophylaxis. Prophylaxis. So what that concept is, as I said before, is kind of like preventing someone to make the move, right? So here there's a very straightforward option to preventing this push. Black plays a5. And the point of playing a5 is now that if the same thing happens, you can take. And after knight takes, it's not as powerful, right? Black can play maybe c6, right? There's no more threat on this black bishop. This black bishop looks better than ever. So instead of playing b4, maybe white could play a3, right? And prepare this again. c6, knight c3. Let's say the bishop comes out, and b4 again. So that was my goal, to expand on this left side of the board, the queen side. So I was given the chance to play b4, and now this move might trap the bishop. What I was suggesting is e3, bishop b6, and then I was thinking c5. And now you might think there's no place to go, right? But in fact, there is a move for black. It's hard to spot, but you have to play c6. The thing is, if I take here, you take my knight, right? So what I have to do is I have to retreat, and you go back. And I can play like b5 and try to use this diagonal in my favor, right? So that's what I was trying to go for. And b6, well, instead I made a waiting move because I wanted my opponent to see if he could figure it out. But b6, well, I trapped the bishop. Takes, pawn up, and now once I move the knight, this pawn is extremely weak. Takes, and I like the activity given in the counterattack, getting the rook out, right, protecting the pawn and threatening to take this. But then I take the critical pawn. In fact, at this point, I could have already taken it, but I wanted to give my opponent a chance. So bishop takes, c6 happened, and black resigned because the two rooks are both being attacked, and there's no way of preventing the loss of one rook. So really in this game, the summary is, it all starts with this h6 move, right? This is where the center collapsed and the first pawn was down. And then the second one was maybe looking at this pawn, or just in general at this point. a5, preventing this b4 move, right? You want to see if you can do something to stop your opponent. So at this point, the bishop was trapped, which didn't help the cause either. And then after that, this pawn fell. So in general, it's just, some hanging pieces and really being aware of opponent's ideas. And that's something we want to take away, is that whenever you can, you want to be able to stop your opponent's ideas.